Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to Raising Parents, the Parenting Science Insights podcast, produced by Ellen Massell, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargeant. Let's get started. Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode. Now, on this show, we've spoken about milestones in development for children, most of the time with an overview of the progress from infancy to young adulthood. Now, we're going to be looking a bit more specifically at toddlers in this episode, sort of answering questions on the importance of different areas of development and how those areas sort of impact the child's growth. Now, joining me on the show today is Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, Dr. Art Markman. Now, thank you so much for joining me on the show today, Art.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's great to be here.
So now, Art, we're going to be looking and talking about toddlers and also their growth to be managing adults in society. Could you tell me and the viewers a little bit more about your professional background and how you got into this particular field of research?
Yeah, so I'm a cognitive psychologist by training. I study reasoning and decision-making and motivation. I've been in the field for 30 years now. I currently am on the faculty at the University of Texas, and so I have both my academic background as well as my university administration work. And I think that as somebody who has been focused on thinking broadly over the course of my career, I think one of the things that's important to recognize is that adults really, we develop out of being kids. And unlike most of the other animals on planet Earth, we don't come programmed with a lot of behaviors. So just to put this into perspective, many years ago, I had a baby deer born on my front yard and popped out of its mom. Within 24 hours, it had stood up and bounded off with its mom. And within a year, it was a fine, upstanding member of the deer population of Austin, Texas. My kids, and I have 3 kids, are in their 20s, and they're just barely becoming productive members of society now. Right? So what's the difference between a deer that can be a productive member of its deer community in a year or two and my kids who needed a few decades of growth and development before they could become productive members of society? And the answer is that the adaptation that we have as humans is our ability to learn from other people. And because of that, we have this long period of time where we have to learn to do everything. And what that allows us to do is to adapt to this information environment that we live in. So those deer born in Austin, Texas, they can't use an iPad. They can't cross the street particularly well. They don't know how to shop for groceries. And my kids can do all of those things because even though that wasn't necessarily in our ancestral evolutionary environment, we were able to learn it by learning it from other members of our species. And so what's fascinated me as a psychologist is how does that work? I'm interested in adult cognition, but I'm interested in how do we get to adult cognition from being kids who don't know anything and who have to learn to adapt to the world as it is right now.
No, that is a very interesting perspective because sort of looking at it, comparing how other species like deers, for example, how they sort of go through it and then seeing, like you said, it takes kids a couple of decades to really do something productive and sort of be something that is going to help society in any way. It's sort of interesting to like you said, it's interesting to see how that starts. And I've talked to a lot of my friends who have kids, and they raise their kids the same, somehow they're both very different. So it is a very interesting aspect to sort of link into. And I love the idea of being like sort of looking at the cognitive development, because I think that's a big aspect to how a lot of kids sort of react to certain situations. And yeah, no, that is such a great introduction to what we're talking about today. And I can't wait to get into it even further as we dive into the episode. But I do want to get some of your recommendations and sort of start off with a little icebreaker to get to know some of your interests as well. So we start to know about you before we dive into what we're talking about. So the first question is, do you have a favorite book?
Boy, a favorite book. You know, it's funny. I'll tell you, I've read The Lord of the Rings probably a half dozen times over the years in my life. And so I guess that would, purely from a numbers standpoint, that would have to qualify. But I'm fascinated by, these days, fascinated by presidential biographies. It's not so much that they're favorite books as so much as I have been reading just about effective leaders. Because, in some sense, for the same reason as being interested in kids is that leaders have to learn how to lead. Right. So I think all of us, if we want to be more effective in anything we do, part of what we need to do is to figure out how other people who were successful managed to do that. And lately, I think because I have some colleagues who are historians, I've managed to get good recommendations for books on different presidents.
No, that's really cool, because you're right. Like, when you talk about how we sort of grow up, we all grow up to be sheep. It takes very special people to grow up to become leaders. So no, that is, I do like, I think I read the Barack Obama biography, and that was a very interesting read for me. It was recommended by my dad, but he was like, okay, I know that you're not into biographies, but I feel like this is one that you have to read. So none of us were allowed to read anything else until we finished that. So it was a big motivator.
That's terrific.
Now, what movie have you enjoyed recently?
I will say that both halves of the Barbenheimer movies this summer were a blast. To be honest, Oppenheimer was fantastic, but the Barbie movie was also terrific. So it's always fun when there's a movie that turns out to be broadly popular and successful and is actually also worth watching.
Yes, no, I agree with that. And I love the fact that there were so many people doing the double feature. So diving from Oppenheimer, getting changed real quick and going straight into Barbie, because I feel like both of them were very impactful for 2023. Yep. And those were really big movies.
Yeah, agreed.
So when it comes to a podcast, do you have any podcasts that you would recommend to our viewers today?
I do a podcast, so I'll recommend that one to start with. I do a show called Guys on Your Head. It's the beauty of it's only 7.5 minutes long. It's a colleague of mine and I, and we just have discussions about psychology, which is great fun. In terms of podcasts that aren't mine, I'll give you a couple. I have a colleague actually at the University of Texas, Jeremy Surrey, who does a beautiful podcast called This Is Democracy. That's just a fascinating listen. He does it with his son actually, and they're great interviewers. And then I've had a chance to do a few other people's shows that I like. There's the comedian Paula Poundstone has a nice podcast called Nobody Listens to Paula Poundstone. It's a lot of fun, and recommend that one too.
Oh, that's amazing. I get so many good recommendations for podcasts every time I come on here. And it's, especially when it comes to psychology, I think it's something so interesting about understanding things in that you would have to go to university to understand any other way. But you talk about it in such a simple conversational way rather than just, this is a textbook, go ahead and read that. So yeah, no, I love podcasts like that because I always learn something, but you're not sort of just like, you're always questioning it, which is really nice.
Well, and it's what I like about it too is, unfortunately, psychology, despite the fact that all of us are people and we're going to need to know some psychology in order to successfully navigate the world, we don't get taught much of it in school. And so we have to use tools like podcasting to get the word out a little bit more.
Yes, no, that's very true. Unless you choose the subject, you're really not going to learn anything from it. You're really not going to learn it at all. So no, I think you're right when it comes to the amazing use of podcasts for 2024 and how we should really put that in the ins column for 2024. Now, when it comes to role models, do you have one that you could share with us, either in your professional or even your personal life?
Yeah, I've been fortunate to have a lot of great role models. Professionally, all sorts of people. I mean, starting with my graduate advisors who were just amazing researchers, Dedrick Gentner, Doug Medine, who taught me a tremendous amount about how to think about the science of what I do. But I think professionally, I've been lucky to have a lot of other great role models. I did a lot of work for a company for Procter and Gamble for a long time, and one of the folks I met there, a guy named Craig Wynette, was also just incredibly open and generous with his time, really willing to just teach what he knew and to share his knowledge, but also to share his approach to dealing with people. I've been very fortunate over the years to really have lots of people who have helped me to get to where I am. And I think it's a great example of actually what we're going to talk about when we talk about kids, because all of us throughout our lives need people to teach us how to get where we're going.
Yes, no, that's very true. And it's amazing to see how many people are huge motivators of work that other people do and always sort of standing beside. That's what I love about, I think, the professional industry, is the fact that everyone's really pushing each other to do better in different ways. And I think and it's an amazing thing that I feel we don't really get to see when we're in high school, when we're younger, because we always see, okay, we're just getting told what to do. But in reality, it's that motivation to do better. And we take it differently as we become an adult. Yeah.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, that willingness to recognize that we don't know everything, that we need help throughout our lives. It doesn't end. There's always problems that go just beyond what you're capable of doing, and that being willing to accept that help from other people, turns out to be something that kids do very well, that actually as adults we sometimes struggle with.
Yes, no, I can definitely understand that. Now, when it comes to courses, do you have a course that really has inspired you to sort of pursue the interests of research that you have now?
It's funny. When I look back over my own life, I was a cognitive science major back when I was an undergraduate, and actually most of the coursework that I did was in computer science. And I think that had I grown up now instead of going to college in the 80s when I did, I might very well have gone more in the direction of artificial intelligence as a profession. But in the 80s, computers were slow and they didn't have access to a lot of data. And I really, at the time, felt like it would be very hard to make progress in that field. And so as much as I loved those kinds of computational courses, I really did feel like I'd be able to make more progress trying to understand intelligent behavior by studying people rather than by trying to study computer systems. And so it's interesting that in many ways, a lot of the courses that influenced me were computational courses. They were in computer science, but even though I ended up going in the direction of studying human psychology.
The way that technology is sort of going, there's always going to be a connection between the human brain and AI or computers. There's always going to be some kind of connection. So I'm pretty sure you'll find there'll be an area of research that really will connect, which will be really interesting to see.
Yeah, I have no doubt.
So when we're talking about parenting today, and I know that everyone has a very different understanding or definition as to what parenting and being a parent is. To you personally, what would your definition of parenting be?
Well, as a parent, you have this tremendous responsibility to help this young person become a productive member of society in all of the dimensions that happens, which means supporting emotional development, supporting cognitive development, conceptual development, creating structures in which our kids can learn to do the things that they need to do, can learn to navigate the way that society works, to understand the cultural norms. What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be an effective person? These are the things. This is what the job of parenting is about. I mean, in some sense, to go back to what I was saying, earlier, your kid pops out without a lot of knowledge. What kids pop out with is a little bit of survival skill, how to get some food into their system, and then a lot of knowledge about how to pay attention to other members of the species. And early on, the most important members of the species to your kid are going to be, the parents. So you have this incredible opportunity to influence what your child learns and how they begin to develop an orientation towards the world around them and the people around them. And that's really the fundamental role that parents are playing.
So when it comes to new parents, what would your piece of advice be on their road to sort of be transitioning into being a parent?
Yeah, relax. So one of the things we know about parenting is while parents have a tremendous influence on their kids, lots of people over the course of a child's life are going to have an influence on who they are. And it's remarkably difficult to mess your kids up too badly. And so what I usually try to tell new parents is feed your kids, don't hit them, try not to yell at them too much, and then relax. It's the rest of it'll be fine. There's just not a lot you can do to mess things up. And so instead of worrying about messing things up, spend your time worrying about how to engage. Just, create really the best engagements with your kids that you can. Play with them, answer their questions, give them opportunities to mess things up. Let them experience the full range of emotions in the world, and do your best to have as good a time as possible while you're doing it. I think parenting can be really stressful. Parenting toddlers is less stressful in many ways than parenting teenagers, which is a whole other animal. But just enjoy all those moments. And I will say, as somebody now whose kids are all in their 20s, when people who've been parents tell new parents, enjoy the time because it goes quickly, everybody rolls their eyes, but it's true.
Yeah. I think I can definitely see that my dad would definitely agree with that, in how sort of focusing so much on raising them that you forget to really enjoy them. And he would say the same thing about how we grew up and how I'm in my mid-20s now. My sister is she entered her 20s about 2 years ago. And now there's a whole other ball game about raising 20-year-olds, he always says.
Yeah, exactly.
So do you believe in sort of being a child being raised by community, not just by the parents itself?
Well, children have to be raised by community in the sense that certainly we give a nuclear family a special responsibility to make sure that kids are clothed and fed and things like that. But almost everything we do has a communal aspect to it, whether we think of it that way or not. I mean, even if all you do is allow your kid to watch television or to play with an iPad, you are engaging with a community. You're just engaging with a community of people who created content for the TV or built apps for the iPad. Mm-hmm. So everything we do is done by a community. And so one of the things we want to do is to figure out who's the community that we want our kid to be a part of, and how do we then choose a community that shares the values that we have, that enables us to allow our child to grow up seeing the kinds of adults that we would like them to be. Because even from a young age, kids are developing a sense of who their role models are going to be. They're developing a sense of what kind of behavior is reasonable to engage in. Mm-hmm. And and it's amazing the things that kids remember. And I'll just tell a quick story. When I was, maybe 3 or 4 years old, 4 years old probably, so I probably don't have memories earlier than that. But I was about 4 years old. Every evening, my parents would have a cup of coffee after dinner, and my dad would drink his coffee black, and my mom would drink her coffee with cream and sugar. And from that early experience, I kind of internalized that men drank their coffee black and women drank their coffee with cream and sugar, which isn't true. That's what I internalized as a kid. And so when I was a teenager and started drinking coffee, I started drinking my coffee black because I thought that's how you were supposed to do it. And it was, by the time I realized that actually I was allowed to drink my coffee any way I wanted to, I liked it black.
So by the time you sort of realized that anything was okay, you're like, I'm really used to this.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think we are teaching all the time, not just when we're in a formal classroom environment, not just when we think we're sitting down to teach something. Everything we do, particularly for preschoolers, is a learning experience.
Mm-hmm. So when talking about, and to start our discussion today, could you provide our listeners with an overview of some of the key stages of brain development in toddlers and how that impacts their growth?
Yeah, so the thing about toddler brain development is that what's happening is that that toddlers are building up this web of connections among neurons. So as young infants are born with more neurons than they need, and early on, a lot of neurons, don't stop functioning because basically you're trying to figure out which ones are going to form stable connections. By the time you reach the preschool years, what you're really trying to do is to solidify pathways that are going to support a variety of important functions. So some of those are going to be cognitive. How do I learn what categories of things there are in the world? How do I learn to understand that world? How do I learn to understand what causes other things in the world? So those are going to be cognitive pathways we're laying down. We're going to get some initial development in the frontal lobes of the brain that will continue, frankly, until you're in your early 20s. That will help children to learn to control their emotions a little bit, right? Because one of the things that we know is that learning is frustrating, and so balancing that ability to try things with the ability to withstand a little bit of frustration when something doesn't go as you want it to, learning to develop those pathways to stick with something long enough that you can learn to do it. Those pathways are developing in the frontal lobes of the brain. There are lots of area, in the sort of side of the brain, around the ears. Inside of that, you've got a lot of language areas that are developing that are helping children to develop more sophisticated syntax with language. That is the variety of ways that you can put words together. as well as a more elaborated set of concepts that you can name and use. And so those pathways are developing. And then, you're getting continued development of the pathways between your sensory systems. So your visual cortex, for example, tends to be towards the back of the brain. Some of the auditory cortex is intermingled a little bit further forward than the auditory cortex, and some of it is around the areas where language is. And those areas of the brain are solidifying connections to the areas of the cortex that are affiliated with your motor ability, your ability to plan movements of different kinds. And then all of that also has to coordinate with areas like the cerebellum, which is a little bulb in the back of the brain, that are helping you to develop more coordinated kinds of motions. And so if you think about the transition, think about kids, 2-year-olds versus, say, 5-year-olds. 2-year-olds are not so steady on their feet, not so great on the playground, still hanging on to things. They're good with a lot of the gross motor kinds of things, those big muscle movements, but not necessarily really terrific with very fine movements. By the time a kid is 5 years old, that fine motor development has really accelerated, and so there's a lot more fine movements that they're making with their fingers. There's obviously still a lot of work to go, but you've got a lot more of that developing, and it all develops through practice.
Mm-hmm.
The thing about a lot of times when we think about learning, unfortunately, because of the way schools work, we think about learning as being planted down in a seat facing forward and having information thrown at you. Even as adults, learning is supposed to happen in an active way, not really in the passive way we often set it up. But for kids, all learning is deeply active, and so building up all of those connections, whether it's actually about motor coordination, about that ability to coordinate movements, or whether it's even about conceptual kinds of work. Embedding that in real world situations is incredibly important for brain development.
So that means a lot of the first few years especially are focused on trial and error. Sort of, I'm going to push myself to stand up, and if I fall, I fall. I don't know what's going to happen if I manage to stand up, or if I manage to grab something, what's going to happen to that? And then they figure that out as they go along. So it comes with, I guess, repetition of learning something.
Yeah, a lot of this learning, there's definitely a lot of repetition. There's a lot of failure, a lot of not just failure, but learning by approximations. And so you try a movement and you get it sort of the way you want it, but it doesn't quite go the way you want it. The next time it's a little bit better, and the next time it's a little bit better than that, and then the time after that it's worse than it was before. And so it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But it's a lot of learning by doing. And and we have to create those opportunities to do, and those opportunities to fail safely. Physically, kids are very resilient. If I fell the number of times that a toddler falls, I'd be really sore the next day. But toddlers they have the advantage of being much closer to the ground than I am, and so their bodies are more resilient to those kinds of physical failures. But yeah, you just have, and I think that one of the things we lose as adults is that willingness to be wrong. And I think one of the things we know, for example, about language development is that when a child learns languages early in life, certainly before the age of, if you start a new language before the age of 8 or 9, and certainly if you started as a young child or a toddler, you will undoubtedly gain native proficiency if you stay in that language using environment, which is the reason why it's wonderful for kids to grow up in bilingual environments. But as adults, it can be very difficult for adults to achieve native fluency. And for a long time, psychologists thought that there was something about the brain that stopped people from being able to learn languages if they learned them as teenagers or adults. And the more recent research suggests that there's nothing about the brain per se. It's that teenagers and adults don't like to be wrong. We don't like to display our complete lack of knowledge and understanding, and that adults who are willing to speak like toddlers and make grammatical errors and use the wrong word and use prepositions in the wrong way and all sorts of things like that, which is what kids are doing as they're slowly acquiring the languages they're going to speak. If adults are willing to make those same kinds of errors, then they ultimately can achieve that same native fluency. But kids, they're much less self-conscious about those kinds of mistakes.
I think especially because society sort of looks at them as like, oh, if they butcher the language, for example, no one's going to be started laughing at them saying, oh, why are you saying it like that? Whereas when we're adults, everyone's going to be like, why are you talking like that? Why don't you say it properly? So I think there's a lot of like societal issues that a lot of kids really don't face, and that always everyone looks at them saying, oh, they're so cute, even when they say something wrong or they do things the wrong way. So I guess we're sort of don't have that high expectations on kids as much as we do on a lot of the adults of ourselves.
That's right. So, we give kids a free pass. We really need to give adults who are trying to learn a new thing a free pass also. But it, that ability and willingness to try things and be wrong is something that enables kids to learn so many fascinating things.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to the emotional development, what would a toddler's emotional development look like?
So, toddlers are gonna experience the full range of emotions, and sometimes in the span of just a few minutes. If you've ever hung out with little kids, they can be giddily happy and then incredibly frustrated and then angry and then sad in all in the span of 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And so they're, the emotions themselves, that full range is going to be there. I think that there are a few elements though that begin to get more complex as toddlers develop. The first is what they attach those emotions to. So as an infant, you might experience sadness, but it might be sadness because you're hungry or your caretaker just walked out of the room and has disappeared. As a toddler, you begin to start attaching those emotions to other things. So for example, if you have a 4-year-old now who's playing a board game, a very simple board game, and they lose that game and they experience some frustration and they take the board and they throw it on the floor, that what they're doing is attaching now that emotion to a game, right? Which, think about how sophisticated the reasoning has to be to recognize that the fact that my piece didn't make it to the final square before your piece did means that I lost, and therefore something that I should be frustrated with. So there's a lot of really sophisticated work going on behind the scenes there. And so part of what kids are learning is, what are the sorts of things I can attach emotions to? And of course, as adults, we sometimes then want to suggest maybe that's not the right reaction to have to something. And the other thing that kids are learning is beginning to learn how to control some of those reactions a little bit, to recognize that I may feel something, but that it may not always be appropriate for me to display that. So for example, part of learning is trying something that is frustrating. And, good learners learn to suppress their frustration a little bit in order to continue to work on something long enough to be able to learn to do it well. And toddlers are not going to do that extremely well. And some will, there's individual differences. Some will do it better than others, but everyone's got to learn to stick with something, to not allow that frustration to short circuit the attempt to learn a new thing. And so that, in addition to learning the triggers for the various emotions, children are also learning how to begin to regulate some of those emotions a little bit. And it's funny because a lot of times we think to ourselves, well, we shouldn't be teaching kids to regulate their emotions. I mean, shouldn't they authentically feel what they're feeling? And in fact, being an effective member of society requires a certain amount of emotional regulation. We can't always scream at everybody we want to scream at, or display a tremendous amount of frustration with every situation that we find really frustrating. And that's part of what it means to be a healthy, functioning member of society. And so we shouldn't necessarily be upset if a child has a reaction that's probably not 100% socially appropriate because it's just gone beyond what they're capable of regulating. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't put them in situations in which they can begin to learn to do that kind of emotional regulation.
Yeah, I guess especially when it comes to the idea of positive discipline and trying to sort of allow them to realize that this is not something that they are supposed to be doing, but without sort of yelling at them and sort of saying, okay, you're not supposed to do this after they've already done it. So it's sort of teaching them a way to sort of know that this is wrong before they do it, instead of them learning it after and everyone's frustrations sort of go up.
Yeah. And helping over time for kids to learn the signs that they're going to have a meltdown, so
yeah.
which all of us need to learn, right? All of us need to learn, this is what it feels like when it's going to be too much for me. And as adults, sometimes we have to remove ourselves from particular situations. We think to ourselves, you know what, I gotta get up and walk out right now. Kids don't necessarily have complete control over their own environment in that way, but beginning to learn the signs that something's going to be too much for them, is important. And again, they're not going to get it right all the time. But it's a process. And as parents, the difficult thing is how do we create opportunities for our kids to learn without getting too frustrated and angry when those situations don't go the way we hope they would.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of our own expectations as parents as well, sort of going ahead and saying, okay, I've told them to react like this. If they don't react like this, then that's going to make everyone a little bit frustrated and a little bit angry, and it's not going to go well. And I guess with a lot of us, we're sort of in that idea that, okay, because they're kids, they'll do what parents say or they'll do what somebody says. But when the moment that they don't, it kind of, everything blows up in their face. So are there sort of certain things that parents should be aware of when looking into a child's sort of emotional development?
Well, I think one of the things is for most kids, you've got to just, again, kind of relax on it a little bit. Very, very few children are going to make it all the way to high school, still acting emotionally like they were toddlers. And so even though the preschool years can seem really long and at times really frustrating, you have to just you have to allow it to play out. And so I think that's probably the most important thing. But learning what your children's what sorts of things are triggers for them to have bad emotional reactions can matter. I think the other thing that's really important to bear in mind is that the personality characteristics that your children will display as adults are not really evident when they're toddlers completely. That is, there's a lot of change that can happen. And so you shouldn't necessarily assume that, well, my toddler's acting in a particular way, and so they're going to be this kind of an adult. It's not the case. And I think one of my kids was a very anxious kid. Always needed to know exactly what was going to happen all the time, and if plans deviated from the plan from what we said was going to happen in any way, he had a lot of trouble with that, and that was it was difficult as parents to deal with that, and to feel like we had to stick to whatever it was we said was going to happen. Interestingly, as an adult, he's pretty laid back. Mm-hmm. He's very willing to accept that things are going to go differently, and the fact that he was a particular way at the age of 4 or 5 or 6 didn't necessarily predict how he was going to be at 25 or 26. So, I think that's you have to realize that development is a long process.
Mm-hmm. So, how important is a routine for a toddler's emotional sort of understanding?
Yeah, I think routines are actually kind of important for everybody, to be honest. I think if as adults you have control over your world, so you often build a set of routines for yourself, and so you don't necessarily think about the degree to which there's a whole structure governing the world that you inhabit. The more consistency you can create for kids, the more predictable the world is, which just means that your kid can be more resilient. And I think the way to think about this is, it's not that kids can't adapt to a chaotic environment, but imagine driving a car at 200 miles an hour. Right. So those people who drive, who are race car drivers who drive cars at 200 miles an hour, they have to drive that car on a perfect environment. They have to know exactly where all the turns are, and the road has to be completely smooth and beautiful. And then you push the car to its complete limits. The more predictability you create for kids, the better the road conditions you're building, so that your kid can be less resilient. That is even on the days that your child has less resilience because maybe they didn't sleep as well or whatever it is. If your environment is predictable and kind in that way, then you're not driving your kid at 200 miles an hour, and so they can then handle some of the other things that go on. And I think that when you create a chaotic environment for kids, they'll do fine when everything is perfect. Mm-hmm. But you're driving your kid at 200 miles an hour at that point, and if anything else goes wrong, then you're making that situation one that could be really difficult for them to manage emotionally. And again, as adults, you see the same thing when people say, I had a really terrible day at work, that this got sprung on me at the last minute. And then this other surprise happened, and you come home and then you're miserable the rest of the day because lots of things that you didn't expect happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. Now, when it comes to some of these common challenges that toddlers sort of encounter, how can parents sort of support their own sort of the cognitive ability and also the language skills that's sort of needed for toddlers at that age?
Yeah, I think that part of what you want to do is to try to teach skills outside of the context in which they're going to be needed first. So, so teaching children language about the emotions that they're experiencing, teaching children strategies related to what they can do in difficult situations. Those are things you need to do when the situation is not difficult, mm-hmm. At least at first, because it's hard to learn when you're frustrated or angry or sad or mad, right? That's not the ideal time to learn anything. And so I think, the trick is to find good, calm moments to teach some of these things, and then to try to reinforce them, before, during, and after a more difficult situation happens. But don't expect that anybody's going to learn anything when there's a really difficult situation. So psychologists often distinguish between what you can call hot and cool cognition. And hot cognition is what happens when you're in the midst of an emotionally complicated situation. And cool cognition is what happens when there aren't strong emotions that are driving the situation. And when you're trying to really teach some of these resilience skills, you want to teach those initially in a cool environment. Okay. And then gradually help you help kids to learn to implement those in a hot environment. But you don't want to try to teach those in a hot environment. That's just not the place where a kid is going to be receptive to learning a new thing.
Mm-hmm. So will it help if, for example, if the child sees the mother frustrated or the parent frustrated and sees how they sort of deal with that? Is that sort of a lead by example kind of situation that's positive?
Yeah, absolutely. Role models are incredibly valuable. And so seeing a parent engage, have a frustrating situation and collect themselves and even, monologue a little bit about it. Oh, that didn't go the way I wanted it to. Well, that's frustrating, but this is how I'm going to deal with it. Those are ways of helping the child to see that there are different kinds of reactions that you can have. And speaking aloud that inner monologue is fine as a parent to do that, because part of what you're trying to do is to allow your child to hear your voice in their head when a difficult situation happens, so that they can ultimately internalize that.
Mm-hmm. So regarding the connection between language development and cognitive development, what is the greatest connection between those two, and how do they sort of play a role in the toddler?
Yeah, so I think one of the things to remember about cognitive development is that almost every complex concept that we learn, almost every complex knowledge structure, because it's not just simple concepts, it can also be, how does the world work? We learn almost all of those from other people. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, you don't observe 100 cows as a child and try to figure out, oh, is this a category of things? And I wonder what that's called. No, you're driving in a car down the street and the parent points out the window and says, look, that's a cow. Cows say moo. So language is this vehicle for directing attention to things, mm-hmm. and then for creating labels for things. And labels are incredibly powerful for signaling that something belongs to a particular category. Mm-hmm. And then using that to then add additional complexity to the concepts that are being learned, even if that additional complexity is just that cow says moo. So it's language is an incredibly important vehicle for helping a child to develop that initial base of knowledge. So it's, those social engagements are incredibly important for early learning.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of social engagements, I was reading an article that you wrote back in 2012 that was using an example of a study on ownership. And it was testing both 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds to sort of see the developmental understanding of ownership when it comes to similar and different types of toys that are involved. Now, it's really interesting because I sort of thought about that after I was reading it. So as an adult, when I go to a store and I grab a shirt off a rack, I almost immediately feel a sense of ownership to that, even though if it's temporary or if I'm not going to buy it at the end when I walk out. Now, when it comes to the playtime and playgrounds and play groups that sort of go on, how do those really help with an understanding of belonging and what is theirs and what isn't theirs?
Yeah, so what's fascinating is kids learn early on that there's a concept of ownership, that when I give you something and say, that's yours, that object now has this quality of being something that you have control over. And so if I say, that's yours and this one's mine, then then the child knows there are certain things I can do with my thing that I can't do with yours, and you can't do anything with my object. You have to stick with yours. So kids learn that early on. Even 2-year-olds are pretty good at that. Mm-hmm. And by 3 years old, you're even good at recognizing that what determines which one is yours is the identity of that object over time. So there's some fun experiments that were done where they actually used some identical cars, little toy cars, and they're identical. So they look exactly the same. But they would say to one of they'd point to one of the cars, they'd say, okay, this one's yours. And then they'd point to another one, they'd say, this one's mine. Now, the cars are identical, so the only thing that differentiates them is where are they in space? And kids will pay attention to where the car that's theirs is in space, so that by 3 years old, they're pretty good at remembering this is the one that you gave me, even though it looks exactly the same. So kids are able to pay attention to that, to track that, and to recognize that there's something special about that individual object that when you own it, you own that one in particular. And so it's it's a pretty sophisticated set of abilities, and it's something that can be done very quickly. So even in a single play situation, you can say, well, this one's yours and this one's mine, which is part of the reason, for example, that by 3 years old, you can start playing simple games with kids, like board games and things like that. Because, a card game, for example, you play a big game of Go Fish or something like that. Kids have to be able to recognize that these cards are mine for the purposes of this game. So this notion of ownership is pretty sophisticated by the age of 3.
And how does that really fit in with sharing as well, for example?
Yeah. Well, this is how what's interesting is early on, kids learn this concept of ownership to the point where they now begin to recognize, oh, there are some things in this world that I get to control. And so that's that first stage. And now the second stage becomes, but just because I can control it doesn't mean I should control it. And so that's where this next layer comes in of learning to share things, where you're saying, okay, this one's yours, so you have control over it, but it would be really nice if, despite the fact that you could choose exactly what happens to this, that you actually allow that to be done by somebody else or with somebody else. And that's hard, right? It's hard in part for all the emotional development reasons we were talking about earlier, because, if I have a thing and it's mine and I get to control it, and now you want to control it, my initial reaction to that might be a reaction of frustration. So part of what kids now have to learn to do is to suppress that initial sense of, no, I don't want to share that, and recognize that there's some benefit or joy that could come from sharing it with somebody else. And it's difficult because a lot of times when we work with toddlers, as parents, we don't set them up to experience any joy in sharing. Sharing is almost always set up primarily at first to be an obligation rather than something that creates some amount of joy, right? Because if I share this thing, then you get to have some fun with it and I don't get to have the fun with it, or I have some candy and I got to give you some, and so, part of what you want to think about is, can we find some situations in which we can highlight the joy that comes from sharing? So look at how happy other people are gonna be because we shared in this point, and because they're happy, you can be happy too, right? And to really begin to turn this into something that has some value in it, rather than just a chore or an obligation.
So it's having the ability to choose and say, this is what I choose. I choose to be to help someone else, or to be positive in someone else's sort of situation.
Yeah. And there is good evidence that kids do like to be helpful. I mean, there are lots of studies, for example, on helping behavior, in which the experimenter will, drop a bunch of pencils on the ground and go, "Oops," and kids, young kids will walk over and start picking the pencils up to help. So you can engage with that, right? Kids do want to be helpful, and you want to encourage that, and then you want to help younger children to recognize that sharing is like helping.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's perfect. And it's amazing to sort of see how we sort of underestimate toddlers. It always amazes me. Like every single time. There's this show that I also watch. It's sort of like social experiment of a kindergarten, and all these little toddlers, or like 3 to 5 year olds at a kindergarten, and just sort of exploring the playground area. And they go off in little cliques everywhere, but everyone still joins everyone else. And it's so interesting to sort of see how independent they are. And they do actually understand if a toddler is crying, they will go over to that toddler and start cheering them up or helping them out. So it's interesting how much there's so much to learn from them that we haven't still to this point haven't figured out.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think we have to recognize that even young children have very sophisticated interior lives in which they're trying things and they're making judgments about what's going on in the world, and they're really trying to navigate things the best they can. And I think that we forget that at our peril. Right? We really need to recognize that kids are trying to make a lot of sense out of the way that the world is functioning, and that our job as parents is to help make that more sophisticated, to help to promote the values that we think are important, and to really support that ability to become even more sophisticated in their ability to do the things that they do.
Mm-hmm. Now, this leads us well into the next part of the show, which is practice and habit part of the show. Now, this is some of your own practice that you do, and I know that you mentioned that your kids are well into their 20s. But what is a practice that you used to do to sort of improve their own growth?
I think that certainly I always wanted to encourage their individual interests in things, right? So I mean certainly I had interests in my life, and I didn't necessarily, and it would have been nice if my kids were interested in all the same things that I was, but they weren't always. And so, really trying to allow them to explore things that they found interesting. My oldest son is a filmmaker now. And, I mean, from early on was really interested in a lot of things that related to visual art and things like that. And I think encouraging that was, just important, even though that wasn't something that I ever did, or we watched a lot of movies, but I think it's important to recognize that your kids are going to do really different things than what you do, and they're going to approach them in different ways, and that you want to encourage that. You want them to find, success as a parent is not that your kid has your interests, but really that they have that they're able to develop their interests throughout their life.
And I think especially just wondering how much of it did you learn yourself from learning about from all of them?
Yeah, it's I certainly learned a ton from my kids as a parent. There's no question about that. I mean, and made my fair share of mistakes too. And I think they all turned out okay, despite that. So I think, you have to recognize that you're not going to get it right every day, and you're not going to have your greatest moments every day. I mean, there were days I yelled at my kids, and it wasn't because it's not because I thought it was the right thing to do, but even as an adult, you get frustrated and you lose your temper and you do the wrong thing. And so, you have to give yourself some grace on that, and recognize that you're not going to be a perfect human being either. But you also need to do your best to try to be a good role model in the things that you do. And sometimes that's emotionally, and sometimes that's with other things. I mean, I learned to play the saxophone when I was in my mid-30s. And part of the reason, I mean, I did it because I wanted to, but I also felt like it would be useful. It would be good for my kids to see me learning to do a new thing and learning to do a new thing and being really bad at it. Mm-hmm. My very first night playing my new saxophone, my oldest son was 7 years old. I came home from my first lesson where I'd been taught to get a sound out of the thing. And I was so excited. I played for like a half hour until my lip was numb. And my 7-year-old got up first thing the next morning and he said, were you playing your new saxophone last night, Daddy? I said, yes, I was. He said, I thought so. It sounded like you were moving chairs in the kitchen.
Oh, wow. That is an honest review.
Yes, it was.
No, but that is incredible. And I love sort of seeing that, it having that impact as well, sort of saying that, okay, just because you're learning things in your 30s doesn't mean that you're learning it late, doesn't mean that you'll learn everything. So that's what I love. I love sort of seeing a lot of parents sort of have that, they can still learn things as parents and they're still learning things as parents, which I think a lot of kids sort of don't realize, that parents are still figuring things out as they go along.
Exactly. Yeah, no, it's important. And it's also important because, someday some of your own kids may become parents and you'd like them to realize that they're still supposed to be learning things, including learning how to be a parent.
Exactly. I'm pretty sure my parents are very much still learning how to be parents.
Yeah. Well, listen, I remember a night after, one of my kids was really sick all night, and I walked into his bedroom at like 2 a.m, and he gave me that look like, Daddy's here, everything's going to be okay. And I called my own father the next day. I said, you had no idea what you were doing, did you? He said, nope.
It's a good guess. It's good figuring things out.
Exactly.
Now, so we're into the last part of the show, which is our open mic. Now, this gives you a chance to talk about anything that you are passionate about or something that you feel that we didn't get to speak on a lot about today. So in the last minute or so, I love to give you the floor and sort of introduce a little overview of what you're thinking about.
Yeah, what I would say is, I just encourage everybody who's listening to learn more psychology. It is a field that just rewards additional exploration. And one of the things that's wonderful is, over the last 15 years or so, a lot of my academic colleagues have really begun to engage more in trying to bring the field outward, to take the research and actually give it away or maybe sell it for small amounts of money, in the form of books and things like that. But really try to get that work out there to people. And I think it's just tremendously valuable. My colleague at Northwestern, Viorica Marian, wrote a wonderful book on bilingualism, and that for parents who are raising kids in an environment with more than one language, wholeheartedly recommend that. My colleague Sian Beilock has done a lot of really nice writing about performance under pressure, which is something that all kids have to learn to do. I've written a couple of books on effective thinking and behavior change, and I have the podcast Two Guys on Your Head that I mentioned a little bit earlier in the show. And there's just so much great work out there, and I just encourage people to to really learn about it. I know it's enriched my life, and the more I've learned about this, I find myself using those lessons in different facets of my life, and I think it rewards paying attention.
Yes, no, and I think we've all learned a lesson today as well, saying you're never too old to learn something new. So there's always that understanding that psychology is, you have to study it, you have to know it from university. And if you don't have that, I love that that's a misconception that we've able to sort of disprove today.
Yep. It's like the old saying about planting trees, right? The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today.
Yes, I've heard that saying twice on this show, and I love hearing it every single time because I always forget that. So thank you so much, Art, for joining me on the show today. It was amazing talking about this and learning a lot more about toddlers than I think I'd ever really know. So now, if listeners want to know a little bit more about you, is there a place that I can link down below in order for them to find you easily?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple of things. I have a website, smartthinkingbook.com. Which is one place to find things that I do, but also I'm on social media. Find me on LinkedIn. I have a Facebook author page. I'm on X and Threads, and find me there because I post. I still write regularly for Psychology Today and for Fast Company and a variety of other places, and I post links to things at least once a week.
Oh, perfect. Well, then we'll definitely know that you're active and still writing a lot of new things, which is always great to sort of hear about and keep up with. So I'll definitely have those down in the link below for everyone to sort of see it and find it as easily as they can. Now, thank you again, Art, for joining me on the show today. It was amazing. Again, it was amazing talking about this. And I love this show because I love learning about things that I never really thought I wanted to know about. So it was great to sort of have this great discussion.
No, it was my pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me.
And I hope you guys learned as much as I did on toddler development. I'll see you all in the next episode. You've been listening to Raising Parents, the Parenting Science Insights podcast, produced by the Parenting Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so that we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at pa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargeant. Thanks for tuning in.